America's original 13 states had not even won their war for independence when they began expanding west, seemingly destined to make the nation stretch from Atlantic to Pacific. However, they could not have begun a continual westward expansion without earning the right to the British-controlled land west of the Appalachian Mountains. Most of the action of the war centered east of the Appalachians as the Founding Fathers fought with their pens, swords, and voices against the tyranny of the mother country. However, the British presence at the back door behind the Appalachians could not be ignored. George Rogers Clark stepped up to the challenge. By fighting the British soldiers in the West during the American Revolution, George Rogers Clark proved the American frontiersmen, allowed the fledgling United States of America to lay claim to the Northwest Territory, and prepared Americans for their westward expansion. On January 2, 1778, Virginia Governor Patrick Henry issued secret orders to a man from out west who was seeking to conduct a campaign against the British in the Illinois country of the Ohio River Valley. This man was coming from an area where, according to Francois Furtenberg, settlers had to be strong, constantly facing the threat of attacks by Native Americans. These independent settlers had the strength needed to fight the war, but they needed someone to go east and get permission to lead the fight against the British. That man is 24-year-old George Rogers Clark. His mission, according to Patrick Henry's orders, you are to proceed, with all convenient speed, to raise 7 companies of soldiers to consist of 50 men each, offered in the usual manner and armed properly for the enterprise, and with this force attack the British post at Kaskaskia. Henry later extended his orders, allowing Clark to attack any other British settlements he felt necessary. From Williamsburg, Virginia to Fort Pitt, Pennsylvania, George Rogers Clark recruited his soldiers. Recruiting did not go as well as he planned, in part because the Pennsylvanians were upset with the Virginians for recruiting men from other states. Clark had planned to raise an army of 500 men. The state authorized 350. He recruited only about 175. Despite his original seeming failure at recruiting men, Clark would prove to be a great negotiator during his time in the war, frequently bringing people around to his side. According to William R. Nestor, George Rogers Clark was a master of politics during the war. He knew how to turn hearts, minds, and pocketbooks in his favor. On June 24, 1778, George Rogers Clark set off from Corn Island near modern-day Louisville to capture Kaskaskia, Illinois' largest town at that time. After many days of walking and no little trouble, Clark and his men reached Kaskaskia. The night of July 4, 1778, Clark and his men quickly and easily took Kaskaskia under the cover of dark. None of the residents had been expecting the Americans' arrival, and according to James A. Fisher, the town had been defenseless since a fire in 1766. The man in charge, Philippe de Restall Rocheblave, was caught in bed along with his wife, who, while Clark's men left her alone, burned many papers that would have proven valuable to Clark, although Clark did manage to save a few. The next day, Clark met with several men of the town, including Father Pierre Gibald, the town priest, a meeting which frightened the French as the American frontiersmen were rather encamped. Clark described himself and his men this way: having left our clothing at the Ohio River, we were almost naked. Torn by the bushes and briars, we presented a dirty and savage aspect. In the meeting, Clark was able to tell the French some very important information. France, their home country, had allied itself with the Patriot cause. Cunningly using his words, Clark won the people of Kaskaskia over to his side and gained more valuable French allies for the American cause. Clark and his men may have seemed rough, but they had a good leader who knew how to negotiate. Much maneuvering, both military and political, still remained, however. Kaskaskia was only one town within the large territory. Therefore, Clark sent out men to 4 other towns: Cahokia, Prairie du Rocher, St. Philip's, and most importantly, Vincennes. Prairie du Rocher, St. Philip's, and Cahokia quickly swore allegiance to Clark. By controlling Kaskaskia and Cahokia, Clark controlled a 50-mile strip of the Mississippi River. Across the river from Cahokia lay St. Louis, currently held by the Spanish. There, Clark befriended Governor Fernando de Leyva, which led to several Spanish on the frontier choosing to side with the Americans, providing more allies for the Patriots against the British. Clark's men sent to Vincennes returned with the news the residents there had no idea Clark was coming. Gibald and several others then went to Vincennes and reported back they had convinced many of the French and local tribes to work with Clark. Clark then sent another group to capture Fort Sackville near Vincennes. After an easy capture, the dilapidated Fort Sackville was renamed Fort Patrick Henry. However, the victory was not permanent. Down from Detroit came Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton. Under Hamilton's leadership, Fort Patrick Henry was recaptured and its name changed back to Fort Sackville. Until a trader named Francois Vigo brought Clark the unfortunate news of the British victory, Clark had grown confident in his belief that he now controlled the entire Ohio Valley. Hamilton changed that, and Clark now had a nemesis. Clark would not be stopped by Hamilton. Like a true frontiersman, he knew the country, and with that knowledge, he could beat Hamilton and his men. Fort Sackville was located on a cliff near the Wabash River. If Clark trapped Hamilton, the British would be unable to escape because the current of the Wabash would make sneaking out of the fort and paddling away difficult. Clark and his men began the trek east down the Wabash River and other rivers along the way, gaining confidence as they went, despite the difficulties they faced. According to Clark's later account of his time in the war in the West, this optimism was of course gratifying to those of us who were indulging in more serious reflections. We were now in the enemy's country, as it were, with no possibility of retreating in case the enemy should discover and overpower us. Clark met a group of French from Vincennes with whom he sent back a proclamation. Those who sided with the British could go to the recently repaired Fort Sackville where they would be punished. The rest should stay in their homes and would receive good treatment. Ultimately, Fort Sackville was defended by 33 British soldiers and 36 French militiamen and commanded by 10 officers. They were outnumbered by Clark. Clark's men began firing the night of February 23, 1779, fighting all night and continuing into the next morning. At noon, the British raised the white flag. No one had been killed in the firing, although some had been injured. According to Henry Hamilton's journal, Clark's letter demanding surrender demoralized his men who knew they were beaten, despite Hamilton's reply that he would not be threatened. Ultimately, Hamilton agreed to a surrender as long as he could return to Detroit with the honors of war. Instead, he and several others were taken prisoners of war, according to George Rogers Clark's papers. On February 25th, the American flag was raised over Fort Sackville. According to John D. Barnhart, Hamilton's defeat of Vincennes was in reality a part of the larger failure of the British to establish a suitable governmental system in the interior of the continent, to meet the Indians in an understanding and sympathetic manner, and to win the complete confidence of the French inhabitants. Vincennes would be Clark's last major battle of the War for Independence. He would have loved to go on and take Detroit. According to George M. Waller, Clark figured he could accomplish this because few British regulars guarded the city and the fort was unfinished there. He even released several French troops from their service to him in order to spread the pro-American sentiment in the area. Unfortunately, Clark lacked men, and despite requests to Virginia's new governor, Thomas Jefferson, Clark did not get the fresh troops he required for the campaign. The rest of George Rogers Clark's time in the war was spent fighting and negotiating with Native American tribes, providing the groundwork for the treaties that would be made and unfortunately broken in later years. Clark also accumulated much debt during the war and afterwards, which, along with other bad decisions, would plague him for the rest of his life, proving what the Bible says about how the proud and mighty fall. Some demonize Clark for his debts and even possible treason against America in his later years, but he still was a hero of the West. Despite his tragic later years, Clark's conquest did much to secure the Northwest Territory for Americans. According to Temple Bodley, Clark's descendant, Clark reduced the number of British in the West by 2/5, and as more Americans moved west, the United States cemented itself as the new power in the West. Some of these settlers began the push for statehood, although Kentucky would not be its own state until several years after the Revolution ended. In addition, Clark set up an American-style court system with magistrates in Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Vincennes. This gave the United States a strong claim to the frontier since they appeared to be governing it better than the British had. According to Catherine M. Fraser, with the permission of Thomas Jefferson, in 1780, Clark attempted to set up Fort Jefferson near where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers meet. This settlement did not last due to problems with supplies, sickness, and Native Americans. This site never proved important to American history, but Fraser quotes historian John Robertson's belief that Fort Jefferson still retains its significance as the only Virginia government-ordered settlement in Kentucky. Clark also helped the West by settling there himself. The General Assembly of Virginia granted Clark and his men land in the West. This was some of the only land owned in Indiana until the year 1800, according to John M. Glenn et al.'s article about Indiana's pre-statehood days. Therefore, the land Clark owned became some of the original settlements that made up America's 19th state. According to the article, Why Did Clark Attack the Illinois Country? Many historians believe Clark's victories caused America to gain what became the Northwest Territory from Britain during the peace negotiations at the end of the Revolutionary War. Some may wonder, though, if smaller countries than America have been powerful, how come America needed this land so badly? Part of the reason, according to Francois Furtenberg, lies in the fact that beyond the Appalachian Mountains flows the Mississippi River. The Mississippi and its tributaries form the largest river system in the world. Upon reaching the Gulf of Mexico via New Orleans, ships could sail virtually any location in the world. Whoever controlled part of the Mississippi controlled trade. George Rogers Clark helped the American frontiersmen gain fame, laid the groundwork for the Northwest Territory, and prepared America for manifest destiny. Although his later years were plagued with the results of some bad decisions, and some would tend to focus on these negatives, Clark can still be remembered for his victories. However, remembering him can prove difficult since, according to James Fisher, few people have completed a full-length biography of Clark, leaving a gap in the history of America's founders. Without Clark, America's borders may have been much different, and its pioneers may have had more difficulties as they headed ever westward.